Joining us this week on the show is the Eisner-Award-winning writer of titles like American Vampire, Wytches, Nocterra, Undiscovered Country, Batman the Black Mirror, Justice League, DC Dark Knight's Metal, Clear, The Wake, Swamp Thing, Barnstormers, and an epic 5-year run on Batman that includes the creation of the Court of Owls. More recently, he's been working on titles like Arcbound with co-creators Tom Hardy, Frank Tieri, and Ryan Smallman, Canary with artist Dan Panosian, Duck and Cover with artist Rafael Albuquerque, Nocterra, as we said, with Tony Daniel, and he has re-teamed up with his Black Mirror partner Francesco Francavilla for White Boat at DSTLRY. It is my honor to welcome Scott Snyder onto the Oblivion Bar Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Chris. I really appreciate it. Hey, Aaron. It's great to be here. I'm really I was checking out everything that you guys do, and I'm so impressed. You've had so many of my friends and inspirations on already, so it's a thrill to get to talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. That means a lot. And you've been on the short list for quite some time, and I think I've sort of purposely wanted to time your appearance here on the Oblivion Bar sort of perfectly, because we'll get into, I guess I'll get into that here in just a bit as to why that is. I don't want to butter you up too early on into this conversation, but it will kind of imbue like my origin with comics. So I'll just kind of tease it that way if I can.
Yeah, I'm easy to butter up. So I'm like a compliment whore. So anytime, I'm here for it.
That's good to know. And I want to kind of build off what you were saying there a moment ago. We have had quite a few pretty big guests here on the show here recently. People like Tom King, Jason Aaron, Ron Villa, and now you, Scott. And if I were to try to name some of the busiest writers in the medium working today, it would probably I would just list those 4 names again, and you've been at this for quite some time. And there seems to be no signs of you slowing down. Again, reference the intro that I just said a moment ago and the long list of your work there. So simply put, how do you continue to churn out so many of these compelling stories, one right after another?
Well, I think, they're more staggered than it seems as they come out. A lot of them are sort of worked on at different times. But, I mean, the real answer is honestly, like, I spent so much time at DC pouring, all my creative energy into those characters who I love. And I love that job. And, I know there are rumors about going back and doing more stuff, and I am excited to do that soon in some capacity. And I'm excited to plan some big things there. But after like 10 years, I remember saying to myself in about 2018, 2019, like, I have to take a break, because every single year I was there, every time my exclusive came up, I would fight for these carve-outs to be able to do some creator-owned work. And they would give them to me, and then I wouldn't use them because I didn't have any energy. Because you really do have, you flex so many different muscles when you're in that zone, and there's just a lot more just sort of maneuvering you have to do in addition to the creative. And it's not bad stuff. It's just like making sure that your story doesn't intersect with somebody else's story in a bad way, making sure the characters that you want are free, proposing an outline for that story well in advance, especially the kind of stuff that I was doing that tied into things, metal and, Justice League or death metal or all that stuff. So a lot of it required a ton of extra energy. And so by the time that decade was over, I was just like, I don't care what happens. I don't care what they offer or who's here, who's not here, what's available. I really need to take a few years off and just be able to do all these ideas that had been in my head for a while. And I didn't know how I was going to do them or where or any of that stuff, but I was like, I want to get to do the stuff that some of my friends had been doing. Like, I'm very close with Jeff Lemire, and I had seen him do that a few years prior, where he left and started creating all of these amazing books, right? Like Black Hammer, and all of the kind of Bone Orchard stuff, but on and on. He had all these books that I loved, and I was just like, I have to do some of that. And so a lot of it is just like it's so much easier to write creator owned for me than write licensed stuff. And it's not like more joy. I love both things, but creator owned, it's almost like an inverted system where with Batman, it's like there are definitely people out there that know better than me, know more about Batman than me, know the world better than me. There are editors who have greater purchase on it and have control over it. And so you're always convincing people that like you're the one to tell this next story, and that you're always convincing them, like, trust me, I love this character as much as you, let me say something through them. Whereas with creator owned, nobody knows it as well as you because you made it up. So there's no sort of red tape. There's no worry or anxiety about it. So I write so much faster in that zone with the same level of attention to script. So I think that's why I just was like, I'm going on a creative walkabout from 2020 to 2024. I just want to try everything that I've always wanted to try, and hopefully I can find some good publishing partners. And I was really lucky with Comixology and Dark Horse and IDW, and yeah, man, it's been awesome. But I'm also ready, I think, now after all that to come back to sort of more comfort zone stuff a little bit. Like White Boat is more comfort zone. It's horror. It's with Francesco. Some of the stuff I'm planning in a superhero space, similar. It's kind of coming back, trying stuff that's very different, but still, that's like my home base, right? Horror and superhero. So after a while of kind of spreading out, I'm kind of like, you know what? Maybe I'll kind of circle back in and just try and do this again a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I will say it is slightly exciting to hear you talk about possibly going back to DC, and because again, that kind of harkens back to some of my favorite work that you've done thus far in your career is a lot of stuff you've done at DC. But again, the kind of caveat to that is that I've also really enjoyed a lot of these interesting risks that you've been taking here recently. And, as I just said a moment ago, don't get me wrong. I mean, I love goggle wearing Batman carrying around a baby Darkseid in his backpack or, Jarro wearing the Robin costume, who ironically enough was also kind of like pseudo adopted by Batman. Why is Batman adopting all of these people?
I know. It's probably because I'm a dad and I just like have a soft spot. I wanted more kids, and then we had one.
Yeah.
And we had our last kid, so I think I've stopped giving Batman children in my mind. So I don't think it'll happen again.
Well, my point is that what you're doing with DSTLRY here currently, and also, like you said, a lot of your creator-driven work at publishers like Dark Horse and Image Comics, and this new endeavor with Arcbound, it's just been really cool to see you take all these big swings. So I think I'm kind of up two minds here with this, because I love what you're doing now, and I also am excited to see when you eventually get back to old Detective Comics.
Yeah, man. Well, I kind of feel like, thanks. I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I teach this class on Substack, and like it has the same two kind of twin rules that it's always had back when I taught college and undergrad or grad. Like I've taught forever, and I always had these same rules, and each one is from one of the sort of best writing classes I had when I was young. One is like, you have to write the story that you would like to pick up that day more than any other one. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's political, if it's space opera, it doesn't matter to me. You just have to bring that. And then the second thing is, you have to really try and stay the most exciting writer to yourself, like at all times. And, for me, that sometimes that means trying things really outside my comfort zone. Like some of these books that wound up coming together the best, like Barnstormers or Canary or Dudley, like those are or Book of Evil, a prose book with Jock. I mean, those are books that are far outside my comfort zone, where, I don't do a lot of historical fiction romance, or I don't do all ages, and I'm very, I used to do prose, but I'm really scared of it and rusty. So being like, what, I want to try these things and just kind of, not just for experimentation, but because I have an idea for a book that fits that thing, and just prove to myself that I'm not afraid to do that. Because the truth of the matter is, like, at this point there is like a safety zone, right? And the safety zone for me would be to go do superheroes in a safe way, like to go back and do something like either at DC or Marvel that wasn't risky or wasn't a big swing. Like I have those muscles after a lot of years of working them out. So like if you said, go back and do a Superman story that's 6 issues and, do an Action Comics run that's short like that, that's not hard, at this point. And I have ideas for those things. I have lots of ideas for Batman ones but what would get me excited to do superheroes is if they were like, you have to try something that nobody's tried, or you have to try something that we've never given anyone the opportunity to do before with this character, or that. Like that's where I'm at with it now, where I don't want to go back unless it's like something where I really get to take a swing, where it's like, that. And they are really kind about that stuff. So I do feel excited about that zone. It's more just like the two zones I love the most are like do something that both ones have to start with what do you want to do? Like, it can't be like you're doing it just for the sake of challenging expectations. Mm-hmm. But I mean, like, if you have a feeling about something you want to try, my two favorite areas for that are like, one, something that nobody thinks you can do when it's like, I have an idea for this, but I know no one, even I don't think I can do it. Well, let's try it. Or everyone thinks you've done this and you know how to do it. Well, do it in a way they've never seen and better than they think you can in that zone. Those are the two challenges that always excite me the most, Mm-hmm. So the thing I hate the most is like, and I can't do honestly, is like that I couldn't go back and do like a 6-issue Batman run or like on Batman, or I couldn't go back and do like, a 4-issue Superman story, or nothing against it for anybody else. It's just the kind of stuff that I love superheroes and want to go back and do things with Marvel and all that stuff. But I want the chance to do things, if I do it, that really push me into an uncomfortable zone where I'm like, I really have to compete with the best stuff that I've done. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and also then I have a total anxiety meltdown when I'm in that zone constantly too. So I don't know why the fuck I do it. I really do. I don't know why I do it. Tyler will vouch for me, but I push myself into this zone where it's like, I don't think I can do this. Let's do it. And then I get there and I'm like, awesome, let's do it. And then the next day I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Why am I here? I could be doing a 6-issue Aquaman story. What is my life? But it's I don't know. I feel proud of that for what it's worth.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, because I've heard you say in other conversations from, years ago, that when you first got onto Detective Comics, you were essentially just working on the backups, and then they offered you Detective. And then you had the audacity to go, hey, I need to replace Mark Bagley and get somebody else in here, because this story is, and everybody who knows Mark Bagley, and I think you would agree still to this day.
I love him.
Yeah, he's iconic, right? But like, you had I'll say, politically correct, you had the fortitude to say, this is not right for my story. And to hear you say now that I would love to go back to the big two, because it is comfortable to a certain extent. It's just interesting to hear that juxtaposition compared to you reflecting on when you first started working on comics, let's just say, in the early 2010s era.
Oh, yeah. Well, I feel really strongly about like everything that I did at DC was uncomfortable for me when I did it. And if I went back now, I would do the same. So I don't think it's changed in that regard. Like, what I mean is, I try to approach it always like, you only get one chance to write this character, and you better write your best story ever. And that might mean doing something that nobody likes but you, but it has to be the best to you. And so I think there's like a lot of, it's hard because it's been a long time since like Court of Owls and Black Mirror, and there wasn't the same kind of social media sort of spotlight then that there is now, where there's a lot of anger, a lot of excitement, a lot of promotion. Twitter and that stuff was relatively new back then in 2010.
What we're doing right now didn't exist back then.
Right.
Really?
And so the thing I'd say is like, I got a lot of hate for what we did back then. Like, the first issue of Detective, I got so many angry things because why would you made Jim Gordon a terrible father? That kid grew up to be a psychopath, possibly. What's the matter with you? Who do you think you are? You can't come in and change stuff that. Yeah, I mean, I got a lot of that. And then with Court of Owls, I got more of that because you think you can give Bruce a brother, and why would you do that? And you can't mess with the Wayne family. How dare you? You've been on the book a year, and like all that. And same with even just saying, you're making him look stupid because Bruce didn't know about this organization. And then Joker, I got it again with like, you cut off his face. What's the matter with you? And then believe me, when we did the origin, that I got the worst. Somebody left like a thing in my mailbox once. They knew where I lived. They like left something in my physical mailbox so they knew where I lived and left it saying like I'd ruined the book. And,
what the hell?
And so like, the weird part is like, I know now, because time has passed, they seem like the edges have kind of rubbed off a lot of that stuff. Not that it was so edgy back then, but it was always a mission to do the things that we thought we would love. And there was more friction and resistance than I think we sometimes let on. with a lot of it. I mean, we made Gordon Batman for 8 months too. Like there was a lot of,
The bunny suit.
I got a lot of pushback, but I think the fun and Metal too, man. Metal, they were like, you're making fun of the characters or you're taking light of an event, and and then that doesn't even begin to mention all the internal art battles at DC to get those things through. So for me, it's been a pretty straight line. I mean, now I have a different relationship with DC. DC internally is a lot different. It was much more, I think it's fair to say, without throwing anyone under the bus in any really tea-spilling way, I think it was a lot more volatile then, and it was a lot more chaotic, and there was a lot more personality wars at DC years ago than there are now, and it made it an environment where sometimes you had to fight and yell a lot more than you do now, which was a bad thing then. I'm not saying that was good, but I think a lot of that was a matter of like the time that I was there. And I don't want to I'm not meaning to go down a rabbit hole away from your question, but I think it kind of ties all together. I started there when they were a paper comic company in New York on 53rd Street and Broadway. And like the first year I was there, they got acquired by Warner Brothers. And then the third year I was there, they got moved to LA. And then the fourth year I was there, or whatever it was, AT&T bought them. And then the seventh or eighth year was like Discovery Plus or whatever came in. And again, then now it's a whole nother revolution. And so the problem was sometimes like nobody knew who their boss was, at the time, or you knew for a while, but you didn't know who was coming. And so it became, people in that environment sometimes get very excited to take a big swing or very scared of taking a big swing. And so it's internally or politically at companies where there's that kind of volatility, regardless, not throwing anyone, shade on any one particular person, it can just cause for a lot of different desires. Some people want to climb the ladder in the West Coast and become movie people. Some people just want to go back to New York and hate it. And there's a lot of this. And so you have to fight all the time to keep them like, this is what we're trying to make in this comic over here, this thing. This is what it's about. This is why it matters. This is what it is. And so, yeah, I feel as though it's always been that, like for me. So when it started on, like you said, Detective Comics, it was immediately like, this is my one chance. They're going to fire me after a year. I want it to be, if I just swing for the fence, and I don't care how angry they get, I'm going to fight as hard as I can to get it. If I can't, that's okay, but I'm going to try my best. And the other thing I would say, and this kind of speaks to some of the stuff, I think the conversation in comics lately too, is like, it does suck that you can't, it's really hard to make like a full living in just comics. It really is. Like, it's not easy, Yeah. It's just, it's a really hard field, and it's in a corrective period now after years of sort of IP overinflation and all that kind of stuff, and companies sort of chasing that. But the point I'm trying to make is that, my generation coming in, I never thought I'd make a living doing it. I always had another job. Until I was 3 or 4 years in Batman, I taught like pretty full time colleges and stuff. And I only gave it up because, my wife was going back to work. And so the point is like, I always tried to keep it so that I could always say to them, well, then I quit. If it's really, really, if you're really going to step on something you said I could do and now you're afraid of it and it was approved, then I'm going to have that leverage to be able to sincerely be like, I quit. And there were twice I actually did. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm really out. Like, I'm done. And,
where at the run? So can I ask where out in the run this was? Cause I know you said in other interviews, it was you, Jonathan, and Greg basically locked arms and said, if you do this, we're all done.
There were three times, I think, overall with me and DC. There was once, with me and Greg and Jonathan, when they tried to make us change the name, and they wanted us to, they got scared of Metal right at the end when it was about to come out. They just didn't know if it would sell, and they were afraid that it was like, it was a very fraught moment, if you remember, 2016. And they thought initially, before it came out, people would want something darker and more political. And my mindset was like, they want the opposite of that. But this is actually a story about this moment. It's about, seeing through sort of the anger and the division to collectivism, and that's what metal was sort of about, was sort of being afraid of all the worst versions of yourself and tempted by them, and then saying, I'm going to find the better one, all the evil Batman and so on. But anyway, the point is, like, so they really got scared and were like, we want you to break it into 2 parts and then split it over a year. They basically wanted to destroy it. They were like, put 3 issues of it over here and then like another 3 issues of it in a year or 6 months or whatever. And I was like, what does that mean? Like, what is that? And they were like, it'll be 2 things. It'll be like DC Dark Knights, and then it'll be like DC Metal down the line, like when we get there. Like, they were never going to do it. So it was like this kind of like, they had taken us into a room to like execute us essentially. And so I was like, I don't know what to do. And Greg was really funny. Greg was like, well, we quit. And I was like, well, how do you want to quit? And he was like, just don't respond to anything they say. He's going to kill me for like giving away his secrets, but because he's like, don't ever tell my art of war. But anyway, I was like, I can't not respond to them. Like, what if Jim Lee calls or something? And he's like, no contact, no, just silence. And I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? But like, we really did. We were all really radio silent, and they eventually came around and were like, no, you can do it as one thing. And then
I love how that worked.
I don't know. I couldn't believe it worked, but then they were really happy. And then they were very kind and celebratory, and they all had like the metal guitars and all that at the party. And it was a lot of fun. And once it went through, everyone was relieved. And I understand why they're afraid, but I think that's kind of that's a lot of the hard stuff, is they're not just paper companies anymore. They have these strange masters that sometimes they know and understand, and sometimes they don't. And so in the early years of that, I think it was very angering, because there was a kind of, why isn't this just comics? Why do you care about like who's above you or what promotion you can get into TV or animation? Why do you care? Like, this is what we came here for. And as I'm older and kind of see people's life trajectories, I understand why that was the way it was, but I still feel the same way. I still feel like, don't do that. Right. But at that time I was much more like, rah, 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 like, like what? Anyway, the point is simply like, from Detective Comics to now, despite or because of and in spite of all of the kind of volatility in comics, it's always been that way. You always approach it, I would argue, for any creator out there, approach it like you could quit. And I know if you can't, then don't, obviously, but I would always try and create something for a trapdoor for yourself. Have another job, honestly. Because the thing is, if they come in and they tell you to do something, I'll tell you this, like, sorry, I feel like you asked one question and then I'm gonna
I love it. Keep it going.
I sometimes, like, I had friends. I remember, I'll tell you, I had one editor who told me once, sorry, I'm taking some water. I had this like big fight with them about Court of Owls. It was the first time I ever had a fight with them. We were a few issues in and hadn't come out yet. But we were a few issues into like production. And I was like terrified out of my mind, man, because I was like, this is going to be Batman #1. And I thought I was nobody. And like, why did they do this to me or give this to me? I had no idea how, I was just so scared. It was like I've said it many times, but it's like getting plucked out of Little League and then pitching in the World Series. And it's always your dream, but you're like, I just wanted all those years in between to get good enough for it. Mm-hmm. But when they offer it to you, you can't be like, no, you know what I mean? When they're like, do you want to do Batman? What if I said no? So I was like, yes. But then you're terrified because you're not good enough in your head. But anyway, a few issues in, I got this call from them and they were like, well, listen, we have some news. We decided you can't call it Court of Owls. And I was like, what do you mean you can't? What do you want me to call it? Like Parliament about what? And they're like, no, we want you to use bats. And I was like, what do you mean bats? And they're like, just make it bats instead of owls. And I was like, it can't be bats. And they're like, yeah, it can. Or make it something else. What about like just something else? And I was like, what's the problem? And they were like, well, you just can't. Like, I don't know. It's Warner Brothers says you can't. I'm like, well, who's Warner Brothers? Like, who are you talking about?
Which brother not even talking to right now?
We're still in New York. So I was like, what boss is like out looking over your shoulder? I knew they were moving, but it was like, what? And so they were like, this is before they were moving, actually. So I didn't even know what they were talking about. Mm-hmm. They were like, Warner Brothers is our new boss, and they say you can't do it. And I was like, well, I don't understand. And they were like, also, you can't use James Jr. You can't use Thomas Wayne Jr. We want you to make it his like uncle or I don't know. And I was like, well, that ruins the story, and you've already approved it, and we're already in it. And they were like, no, you just can't do it. And I was like, but can I talk to you about it at least? Can I make a case? And they were like, fine, you can make a case. So they scheduled a time the next day, and then no one called me, and there was like no one on. It was before Zoom. There was like nobody called, and so I was like, "What the fuck," you know? And then they call. Oh, sorry, we forgot. Tomorrow you can do it. This is Thursday. So I was like, okay, all right. So Thursday, nobody called me again. They were just like, I don't know if they were messing with me or what. And so Friday, I called them, and I'm like, "What is happening? Like, you guys said that I could talk to you," and they're like, "Yeah." We talked to them again, Warner Brothers, and they just said you can't do it. So, have a nice weekend. And I was like, what?
Have a nice day, I guess.
Oh my God, dude. So I was like, no, I'm coming in to talk to you. So I drove into the city from my house. I'm like a couple hours out of the city. Drove in, and I was deliberately like, looked like I was in my like pajamas, like sweatpants and my glasses and I was like, looked like a lunatic. I like came in. I was like, I'm having this meeting with you and explaining to you why, like my case, even if you reject it. And so they were really funny. They were like, you know what? You can have it. And I was like, well, what about Warner Brothers and all this stuff? And they were like, it's fine. And I realized there was no Warner Brothers. But I was like, what was the problem? Like, why did you say that? And they were like, we were trying to protect you because we were worried that Owls was too much like Owlman. And I'm like, okay, but why don't you just say that? And anyway, the point is, the next day, one of the editors, I don't want to throw too much shade, but one of the editors was like, it's a real shame that you did that, And I was like, why is it a shame? And he was like, well, because, people really liked when you came into the office before that. You're a really liked writer. But like, you do those things and like, people just don't really want you in the office because think you're, you're just like really, I don't know, an asshole or something. And I remember being like really horrified by this and being like, oh my God, like I've totally screwed myself. And then like kind of walking around and being like the city after this in the block and being like, you know what? Honestly, I don't care. Like, I don't care because we got the story that we wanted and they were the ones being assholes about it. Like I wasn't, and I'm not saying drive into the company and be a crazy person, but what I realized at that moment was that it didn't matter to me if like, it didn't matter as long as everybody is nice to each other. I'm not saying be mean. I'm not saying be a rotten or yell or any of that inappropriate stuff, but I'm saying stick up for the things you believe in. And if they don't like you because you're causing trouble by that, then I don't see a problem with that, honestly. And so it was a real turning point for me where I was just like, you know what? I don't care if you like having me in the office or you don't. Like, I'll always be nice to you and this, but I'm always also going to stick up for the things that I think are right. And especially if you approve them and then like we're doing them and you can't just like turn around. I know you can, but you shouldn't turn around the last minute and be like, no, you can't. Call it the court of, birds or the court of canaries or something like that. And by the way, guess what? I'm secretly your great uncle, Bruce. Like, what's that about?
Right.
So it was just, anyway, that was one time anyway, the times that we almost quit were the metal Rebirth. When Rebirth started, I had an issue with stuff where they had told me there was a lot of like, I came off Batman, and then there were a couple books that the thing that wound up being All-Star, which I adored and loved working on, was initially going to be sort of a different series, and they wanted me to do it, and then they wanted me to do something else, and so they told me, we're not going to let you do that unless you do this too. And I was like, I don't want to do both those things. And they were like, well, we'll only let you create this if you do this. And I was like, well, then I quit, And that was very tense. But then there was one time on death metal that I quit when it was at the very end when everything was going really haywire. And again, to make it fair, again, these companies sometimes go through like a lot of revolution, like very quickly. And right now I think it's just, something to be aware of is like people go out there and they yell about comics for all kinds of reasons about why is this happening? Why is that happening? And they'll drag things into a culture war. They'll drag things into, and sometimes literally what's happening is literally like the fact that people are just trying to figure out what is wanted by people above them. And that what that means a lot of the time is creating things that sometimes take big risks in awesome ways. Sometimes are really safe in other ways that can be good or bad. Sometimes are, and you see that happen now and again. And I just mean there's a lot of the time, like what's happening internally is a mystery to people outside. Mm-hmm. And, you can guess whatever you want. Like, well, it's because this creator hated this and you have no idea. Like a lot of the time it's like, it's a book that they've wanted to make for 3 years and they finally get the chance to do it. Here it is. And you think it's something that just appeared and it's like a brand new thing, but it's actually something that's been this person's pet project that they've wanted to do and everybody's supportive of, but couldn't come out until now because of the line. And so there's all kinds of weird stuff that happens, you know what I mean? Internally in that way. And people just don't know. And that 2020 was like, again, was the last time I really was like, I right before I actually walked away was like the worst because it was just like everybody was afraid of the firings that were coming and everybody was trying to do things that were either, I think, out of real passion to do their last good thing or anger or that. It was just all over the place. And so to do an event in that environment was really tough because it was just it requires coordination. And when there's like everybody in their own silo, it's really hard. And not creators and not even editors, just sort of bosses, when bosses are all trying to figure out what to do. And sometimes what to do to save employees, all kinds of stuff. It's just like, So anyway, sorry, I'm like on the couch in the therapist thing now. I feel like going on about stuff that like you did not ask about. You asked like a very easy question.
No, you know what? I'm
gonna like dial in and be much more like this. But I don't talk. I'm not live in the woods, man. I don't talk to anybody. So if you get me going, I'll like talk about anything forever.
Making note now. Keep asking questions to get Scott going on a tirade. Perfect. Got it. All right. Making notes. And it's funny because my next question dealt with this idea that I've heard you talk about a bunch in other conversations about how you said you were kind of somewhat hot-headed, in the beginning of your career. And that always fascinated me because I've only ever known you, as a longtime fan and your work as just being like this very kind of warm, passive person. And it just blew my mind that you would even self-admit that you were kind of this, somewhat of an angry person there in the beginning of your career, especially at DC. But you going through all of that just now without me even prompting you kind of illuminates all of where that all came from. Because all I've ever heard you talk about before was that you had certain disagreements and certain arguments with, DC or whomever the powers that be. But it wasn't until now that when you explain all that the way you had, now it makes sense. And I get it. And I don't blame you one bit.
Well, thanks. I mean, I'll tell you the part I blame me for, and then the part that I don't. Like, the part that I just told you about is like the part that I don't blame me for, which is there are actual times that I think are important to speak up. And, I certainly overdid it at times and like got into big arguments with people. But I feel good about the fact that I don't think really that I ever, like only once did I have an editor where I felt like I got angry at someone who was my friend and editor, and we've since like really worked it out and that stuff. But it was always yelling up, like getting angry at the people above you, in some way. So it was, I stand by that. But not that that's great. But the part that I do think is I was bad about was like, there was definitely a self-destructive streak those first years for me where I think there was a big part of me that like wanted to get fired too. Like the things I stuck up for, I still would stick up for. But, there are times where I really went overboard. I can think about where I was, like driving in and doing that, you know what I mean? And did it get us what we wanted? It did. But like, I don't know that was too much. And there are times where it was too much. There was a time where you might have heard me I've told this story a couple times. I don't know maybe once or whatever. But when I was at New York, right when they were in 2012 or 2013, so it was this first couple years where there was this like rocket ship ride for me on Batman that made me uncomfortable, because it was just so much, man. It was so much spotlight and so much pressure, and you had to keep the book above 100,000 like every month. And anyway, like I remember this was sort of the end of that period, but for me, I mean, of my bad behavior, but like I was always kind of looking to argue with my bosses, or like, you know, that stuff. I feel like also, and anything they did that was wrong. And they did some stuff that was like forgivably wrong, and then some stuff like that, you know, they really shouldn't have done. But at New York that year, I remember getting really angry at the DC party at Dan, and he had promised me something on Superman Unchained, and then he kind of backed out of it, and he wasn't going to tell me. And then I found out, and so I was like angry at him, and I was talking to him, and I was like, they had drinks that were named after all the books, and I was on all these books like Swamp Thing and this and that, and I was definitely like, I think a little over my limit. And I was like, you know, something else, like, I don't understand. Why do you have to lie about stuff and blah, 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 blah. And I was like saying these things, and it's like a company party, you know, and so it's inappropriate. You don't talk to your boss that way, especially in public. And it was wrong. And at the time I didn't think so, but I was like, you know, well, I'm going to stick up for myself, and that's who I am, and yada, yada. And then I left the party in kind of a huff. And then I went to the Marvel party on 53rd Street, 57th Street or whatever at McHale's that they have every year. And by the time I got there, it's like 10 blocks away from where the DC party is. Everybody at that party was like, did you just get into like a physical fight with Dan DiDio? Because that's what everybody is talking about.
That's the rumor right
and
now.
So I was like, no, of course not. And it was actually Tom Brevoort, who I didn't know well. I don't know well, but like we have the same comic store. So I knew him before I broke into comics, who called me the next day and was like, listen, like, I should be like rooting for you to like flame out because we're at competing companies, but you have a chance to like really have a career, and you're blowing it by acting the way you are. And it completely like ice watered me, where I was like, yeah. And I'll always be grateful to him for that. And that was, 10 years ago or whatever. It just got me like, you know what, straighten out in terms of like, yes, you can be angry and you can stick up for things, but you've got to get rid of this. Like there was an edge of like, please fire me because I'm so stressed all the time to it as well, I think, which was unhealthy. And then, it went away. And I feel like, the last number of years, even when I quit, when it was like 2020 and that stuff, like, or that stuff, it never got like that. It was more just like trying to be reasonable and being like, this is really, not working, and this is crazy.
Yeah.
Or whatever. So I feel like I've mellowed out. I've done my work, and I'm like, yeah, I hope.
It's so wild to think back about, think back on that New 52 Batman run, and think where I was and what I was doing when I was picking up that book, every month, and thinking this is, and I'll get into it here in just a bit. I know I keep teasing this really unimportant part of our conversation, but like where I was at that time in my like love of comics, to think that you were like pulling your hair out trying to get shit done, you and Greg together, like, and you're like fighting with Dan DiDio at parties to get things that you want. It's interesting. It would have never dawned on me because I was young. I was in my early 20s when this book was coming out. So it's just interesting. I don't know. It's interesting to hear this perspective now, way after the fact.
Well, I just think, I think, part of it is like, it's really hard I still love teaching, and I do it, like I said earlier, through the Substack stuff, but it's really hard because I don't know that my path was the one that I'd like recommend to people in a lot of ways, like to try and do the stuff I did or be that way. But what I would say again is like, I believe in trying to have another job so that you can be able to be like, I don't feel comfortable doing this, and I'd rather walk away than do that. Because the other thing I'd say is that there are a lot of creators like that I remember from that period who we were coming up together, and they were angry at me, or they would say things to me like, you're giving all of us like a bad name by, you should just do what the editors say to do, and then next time you'll get what you want. And I can think of like at least 5 or 6 people from that period that really had that idea. And I don't blame that or say that that's terrible or wrong, but I always worried that like the problem with that mentality is like, if you say, okay, I'll do what you want this time, and then you do a book that you're not happy with, that book will show, it'll come out, and then people will not respond to it, and that will hurt you and your cred with fans. And then, yes, the editors might want to work with you again because you were easy, but then you do it again, and then fans, don't really like you, and then, or not like you, but you know what I mean? Like they're not responsive to the book, and then the sales go down, and then eventually editors aren't going to work with you. But if you build up a relationship with the fans, and Greg always said that, he was like, we're employed by DC, but we work for the fans. If you build up a relationship where they know you're going to fight to put your best stuff out there, even if they don't like it, like there's still, I think, a level of engagement and excitement and respect that's kind of like, look, I'm not going to do what you want always, but I'm going to give you the thing that I think is the best thing I can put out on the stands, and at the expense of my own relationships and health and so on. So I hope you enjoy it, and I think that feels like maybe the best, advice I can give is sort of try to think of it that way, where it's like protect your creative vision, because don't write for anybody else but yourself, honestly. And don't think that editors, not that they're wonderful. I love my editors. They're great. But it's not their job to protect you either. Meaning, like, if you do stuff that they suggest that you don't agree with, and you're the writer and then the book doesn't do well, they don't have any obligation to keep you on it if it's not selling. Mm-hmm. Why would they? I mean, yes, they might like working with you because you were easy, but they're not going to be like, hey, I was wrong about that, you should stay on the book. They're going to be like, the sales are down, you're out. So the point is, like, you've got to really have a clear vision of what you're doing, and just be maniacal about it on some level, and have the team buy into it, buy into it with them collaboratively. And your editor can be your biggest proponent. They are for me. I mean, Marie, who's now, thank God, like now the editor-in-chief at DC, was she was my editor on Meta. She fought for everything going through, you know what I mean? And Doyle before that, and Martz did that too times. Like there was a lot. I had a lot of really good editors too that just like help push through. So I'm not trying to throw editors down. It's more just like you've got to be able to be like know when it's time to be like, if I make these changes, I'm going to be responsible for something that really I'm not proud of, and I can't do it. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because this is like the third conversation in the last, in 2024, where we've talked to a creator who's worked for DC and has had some kind of horror story with Dan DiDio. But that's no shade on Dan. I think we all can agree that Dan's an awesome dude. It's just, those early days in the New 52 and that time frame, which is funny because when I remember very vividly being in that, in that readership of the New 52, and there were certain titles like your Court of Owls and Jim Lee's Justice League, Jeff Johns and Jim Lee on Justice League, and like Aquaman, and there were like tentpole properties that people really liked, but like people were kind of sour on it overall. But looking back on it now, like you said, the edges have been kind of sanded off, and people look back on New 52 like very fondly now. It's so interesting, to look back on it. And
it is because, well, what I lived was like, I think one of the things that's really hard to understand if you're outside of it is, again, like the tensions that were good and bad at play all those years. And it's like when you grow up in a neighborhood and you're like, oh, that neighborhood with those buildings, right? But it's not the buildings. It's like the people that live in them that make the neighborhood. And the neighborhood is only there while you all are there, and then it's gone. Mm-hmm. It's like this vision, and then it's disappeared. And for good or bad, it's those people living in that space. The space is just bricks, right? So like DC was Dan DiDio, who was very, very adamant about getting people's attention, making sure that we took risks. We're always trying to be daring. And he would push things to an extreme that often was way beyond what people were comfortable with. For creators were comfortable, whatever. But then you had like Jeff Johns, who was extremely good at sort of having the opposite vision, which a lot of the time was about anticipating what fans wanted and giving them giving them something that harkened back to the Silver Age, but did it in a new way. And so it was more of a kind of, more of a legacy sort of writer that way, but always brought something new. But it was about kind of these opposite poles, like blowing it up to make something insanely new, or trying to sort of take the old and polish it in a way that would make it. And so Dan would pull this way and Jeff would pull this way. And sometimes it came together really well and would make something, especially in the years before I got there. Mm-hmm. I think it worked best with like, you know, Infinite Crisis and 52 and a lot of that stuff. And by the time New 52 happened, they were all co-CEOs and stuff, like publishers and that. And that's where I think it started to get maybe more push and pull. And that was the environment like I walked into, which was more like you had one side that was very much about kind of trying to, you know, not forget what came before, but like focus on the new. And then you had somebody else that was very much about, there's still a lot to kind of restore and use as material to go forward with. And that, it was a crazy era because it was like this. It was like New 52, Rebirth.
Yeah.
This, Doomsday Clock. Like, it was like this. And so you were just trying to like, sometimes you were just like, I just trying to, you know, like do the stories in between.
So
and again, none of that's shade on either of those people or any of the stuff there. I mean, I have my feelings and I have my stuff about moments and all of that, but we're all fine. Like we're all friends and that stuff now. And, and that there were certainly like fights and blowups and that stuff. But like a lot of it, again, I think with hindsight, like looking back as more of a kind of, you know, like grandfathered in at this point, like to DC Comics history as someone who was there a long time. I think it's more like you understand the bigger picture and I can understand sort of a lot of the pressures a lot of people were under and the expectations that I didn't as somebody who was like in New York writing comics while they were in LA dealing with all the Warner Brothers stuff. So, you know, I think it's more like fascinating for me to look back and be like, God, I can't believe I had no idea that was happening. Or, you know, Jeff was under pressure from this for the toys of the movies and Dan was under pressure for this. And I was just like, I just want to write this fucking story. Just let me write the story, man. Like, that's it. Like, so I was always just like, you know, comics, this, that. I don't have any ambitions really for that stuff. I mean, I love doing the stuff that I'm doing now, animation and Wytches. Like, I love animation so much. Mm-hmm. It's so fun. But I don't have big ambitions to like move into film and TV and any, you know, any large way live action stuff or any of that really.
Sure. Well, I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit here because my co-host and best friend Aaron, who isn't here with us today, he actually had a question for you about DC's Dark Knight's Metal, and this will kind of conclude our conversation about DC, kind of encompassing. He absolutely he adores your and Greg's dark corner of the multiverse. You know, the Batman who laughs and the Grim Knight and all that craziness that very much all plays into what he loves about the DC universe. And it's been almost 7 years since Dark Days of the Forge was released and began that insane event. And knowing how successful it was now and getting to partner with Greg once again and tell that badass story, how does it feel reflecting on, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit here thus far, but how does it feel reflecting on that series now in 2024?
Oh, it feels great, man. I have like they gave me a guitar. It's like right over here. Oh, metal. Oh my gosh. Like, I mean, like they have, believe me, like I have all it's kind of a microcosm of everything, like a DC for me is what it really was. Because at that point, like, I had sort of been doing my own thing a bit with All-Star Batman and then, you know, with Justice League. And I remember being like, it was Justice League came after Metal. So it was Metal itself. The first Metal I was sort of off to the side. And I remember being like, I have this idea for this. First, I called Greg, and I remember being like, I have this idea for this crazy thing. Do you have like 20 minutes for me to like pitch you the story? And he was like, all right, go. And I was like, okay, it's going to be called Metal. And he's like, I'm in. And I was like, I had this whole PowerPoint of like, it's a Joker dragon and this. And then he was funny though. He was like, I'm in. And he was serious. And so the thing with DC with it was like, I went there and I was like, look, like, I know this isn't the typical event that you're doing, and that it feels like, I know we lean dark and you want to do a dark event, but I really feel like there's just energy in the idea of embracing the cosmic lunacy of what I've been reading. All these events, I had been, just for fun, I had been reading like, the original Crisis, but also like Cosmic Odyssey and all these different things, like, Secret Wars, and just feeling like, you know what, like, at this moment when things were so dark politically, I mean, everybody, it was 2016. So it was just like the beginning of the period we're living in now, where it's just this constant, anger and division. But it was really startling then. It was kind of like, I think that what we want to remind people of is comics is a place we go to find our best selves and just go nuts. And it's also Kirby's 100th birthday. Let's just embrace like that and do that. And, they were just like, no, it has to be called dark something. And I was like, what about just metal? And the biggest fight was like, finally they agreed to Dark Knight's metal. And then because I was like, and there's evil Batman in it, and that's what sold them. And they were like, okay, fine, evil Batman. And a Batman centric event. They were like, okay, if it's you and Greg, it's Batman, fine. But like I told you, one of the biggest fights we ever had with them was like, they approved it. And then they were like, actually, no, we think that it's out of tone with the moment, and it's too light. And I was like, it's not light. There's like evil Batman and the Batman Who Laughs, but they wanted something that was more, I don't know if it was because Secret Empire was coming from Marvel or what, but there was like a feeling of wanting to be dark. And I was like, it's dark. It has a dark heart, but it's like, it's like, candy coated and all this crazy fun. But ultimately, it has a good, bright message. But it's going to get really dark. Like, and they were just like, no, and that's when we really banded together. And then they finally approved it. And I still remember when we went there and they showed us the logo, and it was so awesome. It was the metal logo, and I was like, that's it. And then the last fight we had was Greg drew that cover that I love, where it was like the Justice League forming this,
Yep.
And they hated it. Like, they hated it. They took us out to breakfast. Oh my God. They took us out to breakfast at San Diego to tell us they were not going to use it, kind of thing. And could we make it a variant? And it was like, I was like, do not do this. Like, don't say this to him. Don't do it. Like you, it's beautiful. Use it. It's the best thing ever. And so they finally came around. Jim was the one that like really pushed to let it come around, and they didn't get as far, but Microcosm being cut to the party that San Diego and metal, I don't remember when it started coming out, but it was out by the time we were there, that San Diego
2017.
And it was, they were giving out inflatable guitars. Everything was metal themed. Everything was, and it was the best time, where it was like, you know what? I get where you guys are coming from. I know why you were upset or worried about it. You had legitimate fears. Like you like, we all fought, and now here we're all going to party, and it was all fine. And you supported us in the end, and you supported us. They went out hard for it, and they were really good about it. And so it kind of like represented everything about DC to me, where it was like the whole experience in a nutshell, all of the kind of bad and good, and all in one place. And death metal was similar. It was just, death metal was had a like a more sort of a more personal message for me, but also happened at a time when DC was really going through a lot, and so it was harder to like steer that ship, where it was sort of like, actually, we need you to do, at one point they wanted us to do 2 months of tie-ins, which I was like, that's way too much. And they were like, no, you're going to take over the line, and we need you to do it. You're going to do like 64 books. And I was like, 64 comics you want us to do? And they're like, yes. And they flew out here to my house, like, and we made a big whiteboard, and there were amazing shit on it. It was like Sergeant Rock and the thing, and it was like Aquaman, and it was really cool. It was all like metaled out, and it was like Beast Mode, and it was like Swamp Rock, and it was all kinds of crazy shit. It was going to be fun. They were all like one shots, and 2-issue things.
Yeah.
And then they were like, actually, we need you to totally cut that and just do like 10 issues. We don't have the time before we might all have to. It was like that. So you just never knew what was coming. You were always in a defensive crouch. But again, it wasn't on any, it was just more the climate. So anyway, yeah, and that was metal. I love metal. I'm so proud of it. it makes me so happy to see those designs. I adore it. And I read it now, and I read death metal, and I love them, but I also can't believe they let us do it, where I'm like, Jesus, we really got away with this. Like, I can't believe they let us make Batman like dead and the Lord of the Dead and kill everybody. And what the fuck? Like, they gave us a lot of leash.
Can we set the record straight really quick? I have to ask. This came to mind while you were talking about all this. What's the first appearance of the Batman Who Laughs? Is it the Teen Titans book, or is it the Batman Who Laughs tie-in?
Well, they came out on the same day.
Yeah.
And the thing I'd say is, like, I would always pick the one that Greg drew. Sure. So I'm going to pick Metal number 2. But they're concurrent. So we always sign them both. Greg signs the other one too. So
yeah, that's okay. I was just curious because I remember I worked at a comic shop when Dark Knight's Metal was coming out, and that Teen Titans book blew up. Like, people wanted that book so badly. And of course, it was a tie-in. It was a random issue, I think, of Teen Titans. So
yeah, it was totally random. Yeah.
And it was just funny that people were freaking out about it. But I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about horror, just horror in general, because you're obviously known for horror. Like, that's kind of your bag, right? And you've already created some
I love
all-timers, right? Like Wytches with Jock. You've got American Vampire with Stephen King and Rafael Albuquerque. The Wake with Sean Gordon Murphy. And I want to share some with you. I read a study from Ascend that says, as humans, our obsession with horror stems from a combination of a multitude of chemicals in our bodies that release while experiencing fear, our curiosity with the finality of death and the moments that lead to it, and sort of like our primal accomplishment of embracing fear and the inherent possibility of death and conquering that while consuming horror entertainment, kind of like an over-encompassing. That's a long-winded way of saying endorphins plus the tricking ourselves that fear is, real, right? So as someone, who clearly has a true affection for the genre, what are some of the elements of horror that keep you so interested in exploring it?
Well, I think, like, that's a great question. I mean, I think what it is for me is, like, I've always been like a really, I've always dealt with like anxiety and depression at times, like, and I've gotten better about it as I've gotten older. But when I was younger, I really struggled, especially with anxiety. And I would have these fears that I just could not get out of my head. Like, just cycle all night, panic attack, my parents are going to die, or, what if this happens or that happens, or there's a nuclear attack, this was the 80s, whatever, and all these kind of things. And what horror I started to discover, I've said it before, but like, there was a video store where I grew up in New York City that wouldn't rent R-rated movies to kids, but they would deliver them to your house if you rented them. So you couldn't go there, but you could order it, and they would leave it outside your door. And so it was this like neighborhood secret, the video stop on 26th Street and 3rd Avenue. And it's no longer there, but we would rent all of these horror movies, like Sleepaway Camp. It was the golden age of B horror movies too, the 80s. But what I started to realize over time was that, and it really happened with Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead is like my favorite horror movie, and it happened because I rented it when my friends were coming over, and I was like, Night of the Living Dead, that sounds cool. And because it was being delivered, I didn't have an image. I just had a list of movies, and this is pre-internet, so I didn't know what it was, but it sounded cool. And it had a star, which meant they liked it. So I was like, Night of the Living Dead. And so it came, and it was black and white. And I was like, oh my God, this movie, what the fuck? Like, this is going to be terrible. And I watched it, and I remember watching it and just being angry at it, like not liking it. And I didn't know why, but it kept me up. It was the first horror movie that really gave me like nightmares about all the zombie apocalypse. And I didn't understand until years later why. But what I came to understand both about that movie and about horror's function, like in my life, is that it gives me a place to explore the things that I'm most afraid of in a safe space, where I can go there when I'm in control of it and write about these things that I'm terrified of. And it gives me a sense of power over them to be able to go in there and come out of it. And I think horror movies do that for me too. When I'm enjoying them, or horror stories, it allows us to kind of delve into the things that really keep us up at night and in life we can't deal with to some degree, like death, like you said, and experience them in a controlled setting, and then come out with some kind of sort of new appreciation for things in some way. And Night of the Living Dead, it really was like, it made me realize, like, it was the first time when horror is done well, I understood that, like, it's kind of this amazing pure form of conflict where you're looking at your conflict is like you dealing with the things, right, you're afraid of or that you're angry at, and that's what a monster is when it's done well, is like whatever reflection of us or extension of your fear you could give feet to and teeth to and have it walk around. So like Night of the Living Dead is like all the characters you think are going to live die, right? Like the spoiler, but it's like 70 years old or whatever, 60 years old. But it's like the young couple or the hero Ben or any of them, like they all Barbara. And so anyway, that's my point, is that horror for me has always been this place where and you'll find it in the work, like, right? So I kind of work through themes at different times for better or worse. So if you look at like 2012, 2013, we had just had another kid. We had our second kid and my career was like taking off. And I wrote those books in like 2011, 20, whatever, before he was born or he was, Emmett. And I was just terrified of being a dad again, thinking like, well, I'm going to be worse this time around because I have a career I never thought I'd have. I'm too selfish for it. Do I even want another kid? All of that. And so Death of the Family is like a pure extension of that stuff, and which is a horror Batman story, and Wytches is an absolute extension of that same fear. So you can see things work, like you can see the things I'm afraid of work through when I'm doing horror at a certain moment. Yeah. Like now too, White Boat and has similar themes to a couple other things I'm working on that I can't talk about, but Dungeon has similar themes to White Boat and that stuff where it's working through certain fears, so horror gives me that way in.
Some people will ask me, they'll be like, why do you love horror? Because I love horror, a lot, like movies, entertainment, comics, all of it. And I thought about it quite a bit. And I think what I've come to the realization of is that it offers a feeling that I don't feel very often, I'm 6 foot. I live in the Midwest. Like I don't experience fear very often. And I saw Hereditary when it first came out, and that was like the greatest feeling of like euphoric fear. Like it was haunting. It was the imagery just like burned into my brain like a cigarette burn. And I've just been like chasing that feeling ever since, and I get that sometimes, like for instance, when I read Wytches for the first time, I remember the kind of the opening with the mother in the tree. It's pretty visceral, and
it's the opening scene of the cartoon too.
Yes, yeah. So
it's nothing changed. Just there's only more blood in the cartoon, so you'll see.
But yeah, I find it so fascinating that the kind of our relationship with horror, and also our what I just said, our fascination with horror, and how again I think you're one of the forefront horror writers in comics today, and we're going to get into White Boat here in just a moment, but I just wanted to pick your brain on why you thought, like, where did that fascination truly originate at?
I think it's that. I mean, I think it's I'm a kid. I was a kid that really worried all the time, and I didn't know how to. When you have anxiety, or you're like, again, for anyone out there that has it, like for me, everyone experiences it differently, but like it can be pretty frightening because like it feels like you have a fear, and then that fear will not get out of your head. And every time you think of it, if you don't treat it, or you don't kind of figure out ways of making yourself kind of break that cycle by like being like, I'm not going to think about that. I'm not going to call my friend and ask if that fear is rational. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go for a walk. If you can't break that, what happens? It gets worse. And when it gets worse, your body starts reacting as though it's actually a real fear. So at its worst, it'll be like, let's say I have a fear that like, my kids are going to die or something like that. There's no reason to be afraid of that, but I'll think it like, well, what if they do? And my body will act as though they are. Like I feel absolute panic, like I'm having a heart attack, and you sweat, and you like your heart goes, and it's terrible. And it like takes a minute for it to go away. And then you're finally calm. And then 5 minutes later, you have the same thought, and it happens all over again. And it just exhausts you until you're like, and so I think for me, what I realized was that horror was a place where I could watch a movie or read a book. Like, I remember reading Stephen King. I started reading Stephen King really early. And And all of these things I was afraid of, I could experience, like in Pet Cemetery or in, in The Stand. All those things was like, they were there, and I could read them at my own pace, and I could deal with them. And so horror, I understood it at a certain point. That's when the same thing with The Night of the Living Dead. I was probably 10, 11. In that area is where I started to really realize this is where I feel at home as a reader, as a viewer, and then as a writer, because it gives me a place to really dive right in with no bullshit into the stuff that I'm most afraid of, Yeah. And that's what writing is for. Ultimately, for me, that's why I started writing in the first place, was like, I'm afraid of this. Are you? Or I really wish I was brave, or I'd like to write about somebody who is brave, such as Batman or whoever, in the face of this thing I'm afraid of, to make me braver. I hope you respond to that too, So it's reaching out across that to be like, does this thing scare you too? Do you feel the way I feel? And so there's that aspect to it where horror has always been that for me, Sure. I know it's weird because it's also like slashers and whatever, but when it's done right, I think it's such a powerful genre, and I think it's being done well and all across the cultural landscape right now, in film and books and comic books and in TV, and I think it's because there's a lot of cultural anxiety, and so there's those A24 films, man. It's just like the dread just permeates the screen. Yeah. It's the 70s kind of almost like level, terror throughout. It just never goes away, that tension. Yeah.
Well, let's get into your latest project, which is a horror book.
Yeah.
We got White Boat over at Distillery, for which you are a founding member of. And its first issue is released on March 27th. This conversation will have already will come out later after the release of White Boat.
Yeah, they're going to slide the date because we're making a record with it and all this stuff, but it's going to push back a little further, I think. But we're really happy with how it's coming out. So
I got to read a preview of it, and I really loved this. I think it was like the first 12 pages of it, and it's incredible. Yeah. To kind of set it up too, of course you're collaborating once again with Francesco Francavilla, and the story sets out to tell, and this is a quote from Francesco, a story that balances claustrophobic psychological terror with global conspiracy. And I've seen you also call it your most ambitious and expansive deep dive into horror yet. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit, just to, again, without spoilers?
Yeah, I mean, we always kind of sell it, in some ways, like, I think what it really is to me is it's Francesco and I share this very deep love of classic horror. If you see his office ever, if you Zoom with him, it's like you think you're in like a movie museum for like Creature from the Black Lagoon, and he's got everything. And I remember like when the pandemic started, we had a thing where we were both talking about rewatching classic horror movies, and we came up with this idea where we were like, well, what if we start remaking classic horror movies, but not really remaking them? What if we made our own versions of classic horror movies where they weren't necessarily the old movie, but it was like in the spirit of that kind of monster thing where it had tropes from those things and was our version. So we were like, okay, well, what if we did one about a monster nobody has ever heard of? And then we made it about classic movies, and that was Night of the Ghoul, which is easily one of the books I'm like happiest with in my whole career. I love that book. It's over at 20th Century now. I'm really excited about it. But with this one, let's keep going. Like, let's do another one. We had so much fun on Night of the Ghoul. What if we do something that's about, what are you afraid of? And it was like, let's do something that's about like all the seafaring horror lore, about like the Kraken and mermaids, Lovecraftian stuff. And is there a story we could tell about like you're carried out to sea, or you go out to sea and you find yourself on an isolated island where you learn the secret of all these monsters and this stuff. And I was like, it's kind of like the island of Dr. Moreau. And he was like, yes, let's do something like the island of Dr. Moreau. We both love that story. And so it became this thing where it was like, if the island of Dr. Moreau was sort of the very, almost like the seed, but do it in a way now where there's no Dr. Moreau, there's no single person. It's more about an island that could actually exist these days, where I'm giving too much away, but these like incredibly wealthy people that live outside of national boundaries have established kind of a community to try out different sort of scientific advances that will help the human race go forward, not evolve animals or anything like that. And but they're also responsible for a lot of crazy seafaring horror over the years. And so it's about a guy who winds up being invited without his knowledge to this island for reasons that are way beyond his comprehension in the first issue. But it sort of blends Lovecraftian horror with, like he said, conspiracy theories and kind of global, I think, global anxieties also. So it's really out there. But I mean, I think it's one of our best. It's definitely us two, one of our best collaborations. But I think it's one of my best projects that I've been a part of, and I'm really grateful. I mean, DSTLRY is so much fun. Like, I love that company. I mean, like Chip and David, who run it, we're at Comixology. They gave me that lifeline when like I left DC and I was like, hey, I want to do all these creator-owned books, and I was going to set maybe a couple up at Image and then a couple up at See About Dark Horse. I hadn't talked to them yet. Maybe this, and figure out a way to stagger them so I could pay for them because I didn't know how to pay for all of them or any of that. Yeah. And then all of a sudden they were like, well, Comixology, we'll do them with you and they'll come out. And at first they were like, we'll do them with you. And I was like, well, they need to be out in print. And they were like, well, we're working on a deal with Dark Horse. And I was like, well, I won't do it unless like it comes out in print at Dark Horse. And they were very nice. They hadn't done single issue at that point. So it was like, all right, well, we'll do single issue. I said, I wanted it to be direct market, but those two guys were always creator forward when we were there. And they honestly wanted to do things that help comics. I mean, I think at that time or before that, not even really at that time, there wasn't any real blowback. But before that, I think people were like, oh, digital is different than print. It is. But like one of my biggest and strongest beliefs is that one of the things that hurts comics the most right now, like that really is a problem for us, is the lack of a digital browsability. All these other medium and all these other things, even manga and, have these massive browsable platforms like Shonen Jump and all this stuff, Crunchyroll, whatever, where you can go and you can just read all the stuff and then you go get the collectible aspects of it, webtoons, whatever. And so comics being so siloed, where Comixology was saying, let's expand and have DC, Marvel, and you get a subscription to it. You could read all this backlist stuff. I believed in that dearly. And so, and I still do, even though the company is going through changes. I mean, point being simply that those two guys were always about comics and about creators. And the fact that they decided to start their own company and be like, look, we want you guys to own it, where you all have a stake in it. I have a percentage in it. James has a percentage in it. Jock. These are all my closest friends, Becky, Jamie, Rom, like these are people that inspire me on the page and also love as human beings. And be like, we can all own a company together with people that we know we trust has been wonderful. And the books that have come out from Lisa, Tula, and Becky, and from Az and Eduardo, Blood Brothers Mother, I just read it. It's so good. Every book has been great. Spectrograph is going to blow your mind too, from James and Christian. And so everything has been a huge, thrill to be a part of, Gone by Jock. And so White Boat is in that spirit. It's like at a place where creators are supporting creators, the publishers are supporting the creators too, and we're all in it together. Like we all have a stake in each other and in the company itself. So it's a lot of fun as a treehouse to like make stuff in.
Yeah, DSTLRY is a really interesting idea. I think fans were really excited about it when it was first announced, and I've actually had the chance to read Spectrograph. So along with White Boat, very excited for both of those to get in the hands of readers. And luckily enough, I know you get a kick out of this. We're going to have James and Christian on the show in a couple of weeks to talk about Spectrograph the week it comes out.
Oh, nice.
So and I know you obviously.
I talk to James like pretty much I'm seeing him for dinner on the 27th of this month. And the week I'm driving in to have our regular dinner together. So he's like, I can't say enough good things about him. If you haven't picked up Spectrograph or you missed the order, cut off, go get it. I'm sure it'll sell out. It's amazing. Like everything he does, he's the best writer in comics and one of the best human beings on the planet. So I've like not anything but praise for him on every level. I met him he was my student when he was an undergrad, and I was like a adjunct teacher. I was in my I don't know, my 20s, my mid 20s, and he was like, we've known each other forever. He was a child, and but he was brilliant, and he handed in all these amazing comic scripts and stuff. And then when I broke into comics, it was before I broke in. It was just as I was breaking in. I was like, you know what? That kid that wrote those great things, I want to show him this pitch for American Vampire and see what he thinks. I was only, I wasn't, but I don't know, 9 years older than him or whatever. And so it's and then James and I have been friends ever since. So to have I've said it many times, but to have your student become somebody who you learn from, who's a good teacher to you, is a great feeling. And he's just the best.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see him kind of ascend over the last couple of years. And he's also not only one of the best writers in working today, but also one of the most business savvy in the entire industry, with Tiny Onion. So,
oh my Lord, I ask him all the time for advice now with that. I'm because it's funny too, to see everybody with different ambitions. I'm very conservative in a lot of ways. I always felt like this job would not last, it would never last. And when I got married to Jeannie, we were kids, and I remember saying I'm going to be a writer. We met when she was in med school and I was in grad school for writing, and her part of her work study was to be the receptionist in the writing program. So I was like, oh, she's this, super cute woman who works here. And she was a doctor who was way smarter than me and all this stuff. And anyway, the point is back then when we met, I remember saying to her when it got serious, I am never going to have a career where I'm the one making any money. You will always be the provider in that regard, but I will take care of the kids and do anything to make this work. And so for me, I've always proceeded I've won the lottery. I can't believe I make a living doing this. And then she does. I mean, she hasn't worked. It's me, that I've been the one doing all this, in a lot of ways. And that's been a huge joy when she can take time and do what she wants. And then, all of it is just trying to, so I always act like it's all going to go away at any minute is the way I feel. So I'm very risk averse, where I'm I'm very creatively not risk averse. I want, but I like to know that I have a partner, that's solid, or I'll take a risk and be I'm going to pay for this book. I have a great feeling about it. But if I'm paying for a book that I know will cost a lot of money and it's out of my pocket, then I'll be teaching or doing something else, to try and balance it. Anyway, the point is I love that James is so ambitious and has so many plans to take over the world. And I was give me a job when you do, please. I'll
give me a mind, please.
I'll intern for you and that. But for me, I think the newest thing and the biggest thing has been this really surprising kind of love of animation. I didn't know that I would like it this much, but I love working in it. It's like comic people. It's so collaborative, and it's really not live action stakes. It's much more, communal, and people are happy geeks, and they're also really believe in the medium is about to explode. And Amazon took a big bet on Wytches as something that will be a horror, water cooler kind of show. It's very gory and R-rated, but it's a lot of heart, and it's very different than anything you've seen. So they're going to put it on with Invincible and be here we go, let's see. And I love that they're trying that. It's a place where people can take big swings, animation. So I love that creatively, that it feels really ripe for expansion.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I have one final question for you here. And last week we were talking to Jason Aaron, and he said, well, he gave this amazing story about meeting Marv Wolfman and George Perez as a young person, and how that, along with their run on the new Teen Titans, essentially convinced him that he wanted to make comics one day. And believe this or not, and this was what I was alluding to at the beginning of the conversation, you and Greg were those creators for me. Your New 52 Batman run, as we've talked about throughout this conversation, sort of kicked down the door for me into the world of comics that I now live in, and flipped the switch in my head, proved that this art form is truly special. And, meeting you both at Planet Comic-Con, a long time ago, along with your inker, Jonathan Gapion, many, many years ago, was essentially the catalyst for my love of the medium. So I'm curious for you, do you have a creator or a series that sort of did that same thing for you back in the day?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't have a series. Like I've been in comics like so long that my parents claim that they have my first comic. It still has like marker on it. I'll send a picture of it next time I'm in there. They have a cabin in Pennsylvania, which is where like Wytches was inspired, but like, it's the Superman versus the Hulk. It's like it has the Joker. Oh, so it's Batman versus the Hulk. Sorry. It's the Jorge Garcia Lopez. And it's got like the Shaper of Worlds and all that stuff where it's the Picasso Joker. Yep. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful comic. Yeah. It's like Batman versus the Hulk, and the Joker is in it. And I forget who the Hulk villain is. I don't remember, but it's oversized and they have it. So, I mean, I was like, nothing, but some of my earliest memories, with my dad, or we would always go to the old Forbidden Planet was on 11th Street. They had an upstairs and a downstairs on Broadway. It's still kind of over there, but they moved a few times. But it's and I grew up down the Lower East Side in 21st Street in East River, and we'd go there on Wednesdays. So what I remember was like always loving comics, always reading comics. But The Dark Knight really was, as cliche as it is, like the book that like just blew my head off. I still have my original 4 issues, all beaten up. But I grew up, like I said, in New York City, and that book, between that and then Year One, I don't know how to explain how real that made Batman to me, where, the fears expressed in Dark Knight Returns about being nuked and like, the city falling apart, and this kind of, the New York City was like a mess in the 80s. And there was this feeling that this book was happening in the real world in a lot of ways. And it felt so immediate. And that was the book that just like made me be like, this can be more than escapist entertainment, even at that young age. I mean, I was 9 or something when I read that, and then it just like that started my path. So as I'm sure many, many people will answer that book, but it's true. Like, so meeting Frank for me, it was unbelievable. I mean, I was like, Dan knew how much it would mean to me, and to his credit, it was a long time ago. It was I mean, I've met Frank many times now, and now we're friends, but like, I'm not saying that in a braggy way.
Me and Frank Miller were tight.
Well, I mean, it's been many years now where we're both like in the same sphere and at cons together and all of that. And I'm his partner, Selene, and we're friends, like all of us were friends. But I still remember like him walking into the bar in Hell's Kitchen Dan took me to, and I was terrified. And Frank walked in, and I had it was when I was doing 0 Year. So I was doubly terrified because I was like, he's going to think I'm rewriting Year One, and what am I doing? And I'm never as good as that, obviously. And Dan had told me he had been reading it. So I was just like, oh my God, what the fuck am I doing with my life? This is terrible. And he like came in and he was wearing the hat. So I saw him, from the doorway, and I was like, oh my God. And he came over and he like shook my hand, and he was like, Scott, I've been reading 0 Year. And he's like, for once, somebody gave Bruce a good goddamn haircut. And I was like, can I just like put that on my tombstone and just like, can we end this right now and just leave? But he was great, and he was very kind and very, very supportive. And he listened to all of my effusive praise of the stuff that he had done. And so, yeah, that was it. And I can tell you one other story that like meant a lot to me. And it's this page behind me. I have a page behind me on my wall. But I was 13, and now I wanted to be a comic writer, an artist at the time. And I had like a portfolio of copies that were horrible with like everybody Image at that time. And or they weren't Image yet. It was still Marvel. But I went to a con at the Penn Plaza Hotel, and it was Todd McFarlane was there, and it was my 13th birthday almost, and I had saved up like a few $100s to buy a page, and the line for him was like 3 hours long. It like went all the way around, and I waited with my dad forever, and I finally got up to Todd, and he had already, he'd been there for hours, and I was like, I'd like to buy a page, and he had this huge spread of pages, and it was like divided by price, and I was like, my dad was like, oh, it's his birthday, you're his favorite artist, and he was like, your birthday? Like, come over here, kid, like that kind of, he's like, how old are you? Like 25? And I was like, no, I'm, he was like, he was so on. Charisma. Oh, he's just, absolutely ball of charisma. And so he was like, if it's your birthday, let me pick a page to give you. And he picked this page, which is, you can see, is like Spider-Man full on. Wow. If you can see. That's incredible. It was way out of my price range, meaning like it was not a page that was like $200. I don't know what it was back then, probably $1,000. I don't know. But he gave it to me, and he drew me a Spider-Man on the back, and it says "Happy Birthday, Scott" on the back of that. And I'll never forget like that to this day. It hangs over my desk, not just because it was the first comic art I ever owned, but because it burned into my brain. Like, if I ever make it, that's how you should be all the time. Like that. I told him I actually got to go on the Howard Stern Geek Time with him. I saw him early in my career in like 2011, 2012. And I brought it, and I was like, Todd, like, he was really funny. He was like, God, I can't believe I gave that to you. I'm like, give it back. I was like, no, it's mine now, but I'll never sell it. I was like, so yeah.
Wow, that's a great story. That's a good one. I have to say, I mean, I was pretty bamboozled by Jason's, kind of short story about meeting George and Marv, but that is pretty cool. You get a full page, like a true, page of a Spider-Man page from Todd that's a good one. So congrats on that.
Yeah. And it has a Spidey head on the back that says "Happy Birthday, Scott." Wow. In webbing.
That is incredible.
Like in those webs. Yeah.
Well,
it's the best.
Scott, it's been such an honor to have you here on the Oblivion Bar podcast today. And, again, sorry for sort of butting you up there at the end, but I truly wouldn't be able to forgive myself if I had you on here for a conversation and didn't at least verbalize, how much your work and in your work with Batman on Batman with Greg, essentially created the foundation for my, some would say excessive love of the medium. And this show that we're on right now, the library behind me, and my love of comics likely wouldn't exist without you and your work. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, at least.
Oh, that really means the world, dude. And again, like, thank you for what you guys are doing. You're killing it.
Thank you.
So it's a real thrill to get to be here, and hopefully you'll get to come back when we announce more stuff sometime later in the year.
That'd be incredible. So I'm going to pass the baton off to you. Is there anything that you want to plug or any socials you want to highlight before we let you go?
No, I mean, no. I really, again, like, Whiteboat is still up for order, and we'll be announcing like the final pub date really soon. We also, I forgot, I'm not supposed to say, but we have like special stuff we're making to go along with it that I'm very excited about, where they're going to announce it, and we wanted to make it a whole experience. So it'll be a really immersive, fun thing. But I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Instagram, and my DMs are still open always. You can always reach out and let me know how you think we're doing. And I just hope also, the only thing I'd plug is like, one thing I really love doing the class, like over at Substack. I never expected it to get as many people in as it has, but I'd love to just keep it going and growing it, because it's something that I just look forward to it every month, honestly. So it's a monthly class where we do a different topic live. We do it on Wednesdays, like once a month at 9:30 p.m. Eastern. It's live, but then if you subscribe to it, you can get all the recorded classes on video at our YouTube archive. Like, we have 20 or 25 at this point on everything from like creating villains to different kinds of endings, everything. We have guests. We had Greg Capullo. We had James Tynan. We had Donnie Cates. There's all kinds of people on there. And yeah, Tyler and I really love doing it. So if you sign up, it would mean a lot, because it's a huge inspiration for me. And I really like getting to know the people in the class a bit. So it's fun seeing their work and using it in class too.
Yeah, that's our best jacket over on Substack for everybody. That if you're subscribed to any Substack, I think that's probably one of the best ones out there. So I agree 100%. So Scott, once again,
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I would absolutely love to have you back on the show at some point down the road.
Yeah, I'd love it, man. Thanks so much. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Aaron.